Again, I would like to welcome members of South Carolina Realtors to today's webinar, part 2 in our 11-part series. This is zipTMS, the power of transaction management. I again am your host, Laura, and it's my pleasure to be working with you this morning. The first thing I usually like to cover in today's webinar, or any webinar rather, is just to go over the objectives very quickly. So what we're going to be covering. We are going to be talking about what exactly zipTMS is, and also how to create a new template, including a checklist. We'll also be adding a template to that existing transaction. So for anyone who wasn't part of session 1, we did cover how to create a transaction in that webinar. You can go back and review that at your convenience. We'll also be talking a little bit about our transaction summary and how that works with respect to zipTMS functionality. We'll take a quick tour of our tasks and display and discuss transaction history, and then the agent dashboard and guided help as well. So what is zipTMS? Well, for anyone who is not familiar with zipTMS, it is a fully functional and robust transaction management system that is built right into your zipForm Plus account. That means there's nothing you have to activate. There's no additional outside product you have to enter to. zipTMS is integrated to the extent that a lot of times you really won't notice that transition from just using your forms or zipForm Plus into zipTMS functionality. zipTMS is free to you as a member of the National Association of Realtors, so no additional cost. Everything you're going to be seeing today is free of charge to you. zipTMS is a way to optimize workflow. As I mentioned, it is built into zipForm Plus, and it offers a greater degree of consistency in transaction management. So you can manage and track all components of your transaction within zipTMS. All right. So we're going to begin today by signing into zipForm Plus, and you can do this by visiting www.zipformplus.com. So you go ahead and sign in there. If you have not already created your zipForm Plus account, there are instructions in that first webinar that will show you how to do that. Okay, so we're going to say we've signed into our account. This is what your account will look like once you sign in and actually log into the system. So this is showing our transactions home landing page. Just as a brief review, our transactions home landing page is where all of our transaction files are stored. And for all intents and purposes, in today's webinar, when I use the word transactions, what I'm really referring to is a unique client and property combination, which is housed in a file. So each of these files that you're seeing here are actually a deal that I have worked on or am currently working on. One cool trick I just want to show you real quick is that you are seeing all of these transactions now in what we call grid mode or icon mode. If you would prefer to see them in a list, and this is really just an aesthetic preference, totally up to you, you can click on this little icon in the upper right-hand corner, if you see where I'm indicating, and it says List View when you hover over it. If I click on that, it's going to change all of my transactions to a list view as mentioned. It just gives a little bit more information about the transaction at a glance. So you can kind of play with that and figure out what you are the most comfortable with. All right, just a brief tour of your navigation bar up at the top. You do have your transactions page, which is what you're going to land on when you get to zipForm Plus. And then you also have a number of other icons that sit kind of on the same bar up at the top of your zipForm Plus account. We have your agent dashboard, which we'll be circling back to in a little bit. You also have your templates, which will be the focal point of the first part of today's webinar. We also have your tasks, which we'll be visiting along with your contacts. And then you also have partners and help, which we're not going to be touching too much today. So what we're going to do to begin is navigate over one tab to our templates. So I'm going to click on that. One thing that's important to note is that when we create a template today, this is something that you will not have to do every time you work on a deal. This is something that you would want to do as a kind of preliminary measure in order to save time whenever you create a transaction in a file. So let's go ahead and create a template. What is a template? Well, templates are time-saving packets of information, and they can include forms that you would be repurposing for multiple transactions of the same type. Like for example, if I'm working with my buyer and I kind of know what forms I'm going to be using every time I work on the buy side of the deal. I can consolidate those forms into one nice little folder, and that's going to help me to just easily apply them so I don't have to add and fill in the forms one by one every single time I do a deal. You can see I already have a number of templates created. I've done these for various different transaction types. You can see I have one for buyer deals. I also have a different buyer template as well. I have one for seller deals and listing transactions. So how you create these templates are entirely up to you, but I am going to show you the best practices to follow in order to get those created. So to create a template, we're going to go from underneath the Templates tab, and we're going to click on New. This is going to display a launch pad. For anyone who has created a transaction, you may be saying to yourself, that looks an awful lot like the transaction creation process. And that is because, in fact, it does look very similar and follow that same trajectory. So if you're ever in doubt about whether you're in templates or transactions, you can just look at the top navigation bar right in the back, and it's going to show you one highlighted in green. That is what you are using. Let me just check the question box real quick. So nothing so far. By the way, if you have a question at any point throughout the webinar, please feel free to ask that. So I'm going to determine now what I want to create my new template for. I can create one for a new listing, or I can create one for a new purchase or offer. So let's do one for a new listing today, just as an example. I would stress that it would be important to create two separate templates if you work as a selling agent or a buyer's agent, I should say, and if you work as a listing agent sometimes. That's because these forms are obviously going to be very different that you would use for those two sides of the deal. So you want to package those forms in separate templates. So let's do a new listing today. Let's click on that. It's going to be exactly the same process if I were creating a purchase template, but we'll call this listing template, and I'm just going to call it April 2019. This name is just to distinguish it from, because you can see I do have a number of templates in here. I want to be able to quickly access that. The beauty of templates is that you can name them whatever you want, whatever naming scheme makes sense to you. Just be sure to keep it generic, because as I mentioned, we are going to be repurposing this template for multiple transactions. So whatever helps you to best identify it. Underneath, we're going to select a property type. Again, this is because our forms would differ depending on what type of property we're working with. So we're going to say in this case, just keep it simple, residential. So we're going to be helping someone list their home with this template. On the right-hand side, you'll see an option that reads Scope. For most of you, you do have an individual agent account, which means that you yourself are responsible for the information housed inside of your account. Therefore, that scope is going to automatically default to personal. And this basically just determines who the template is available for. Just a little bit of background, if you are working in a multi-user account, Global and Office allow you to share with anyone inside of that office or brokerage. But for most of you, this will be a non-issue. It will default right to personal, as mine is here. Below, you have your auto apply options. When you're setting up your template, you can determine exactly how you want this information to automatically apply. So I can choose do not automatically apply this template to new transactions. With this, I can choose on a case-by-case basis whether or not I would like to apply this template to a transaction. I can also choose automatically apply this template to listing residential new transactions. And what that's going to do, and I'm going to show you, it's kind of cool, is when I create a transaction and I establish it as both a listing and a residential transaction, it's going to automatically apply the information that we'll be adding into this template. And then you can also choose automatically apply this template to all new transactions. This is probably only going to be something that's applicable if either you only ever work on one side of the deal, or if you're adding a template checklist, and a little bit more about that later on. Okay, so just to reiterate, we were under templates, we clicked new, we established our template type, we named our template, we established the property type that we'll be using it for, and we chose an auto apply option. And I have chosen to automatically apply this template to all of my new listing residential transactions. So basically, anytime I'm helping someone list their home. We're going to click Save at the bottom. This is going to launch me into my brand new template. Just in case you're wondering how we got here, if I click on back to list, it's going to take me back to my template main page, but you can see the template we just created is now reflected as the most recently updated. We click on that, and now we can start to add in our forms. You'll notice the presence of 4 different tabs inside of your templates. We're going to be circling back to parties and checklists in just a moment, but let's start with documents today. So in order to add documents, you're going to think to yourself, okay, which forms do I use when I'm working with a seller? In order to access your forms, you can just navigate over to the right-hand side of the screen. You should see an icon that says All Forms. We're going to click on that. And as you can see, that has automatically displayed my South Carolina Association of Realtors library. So these are the automatically fillable forms that you have through your association. You may have additional forms available to you either through your local association or MLS. So that's very possible as well. And I want to make a quick disclaimer here. Don't put a lot of stock in forms that I am adding today. Don't use that as gospel. I'm not very familiar with these forms, but I just want to give you an idea of kind of how that would work. Okay, I'm going to add in a cover sheet. The cool thing about these forms is that you can really search anything that you want if you have a more expansive forms library, like South Carolina happens to be. You can see there's a lot here that you can potentially choose from. If you're unsure about what forms to use, I would encourage you to talk to your broker. They may be able to advise you on exactly what would make sense in the context of what you're doing. We're going to click on listing checklist. I'll add one of those in. We'll do an exclusive right to sell. We'll do an inspection report. Okay, so that should be pretty good for now. I just want to give you an idea of how this would work. So we'll say that right now I've added all my forms in that I would be using in a listing transaction. What if something isn't available in my South Carolina or local forms library? Well, in order to add an outside document, all you have to do is click on the Add Document icon over on the left here. When we click that, it's going to present us with a launch pad. You can see that there are a multitude of different options to choose from. One is to browse for a document. If I click on this, it's going to allow me to access the hard drive of my computer, at which point I can locate whatever document I would like to add in. And I just have this PDF, kind of an example here. I'm just going to add that in. Home inspection report, I click open. And that brings this right in, and I'm just going to click OK. And you can see that added that PDF document right to my template. So now every time I work on a listing transaction, I'll also have that document in here as well. Another option from Add Doc, circling back here, is to create a placeholder. Placeholders can be used a number of different ways. The most common is for brokerages to establish their best practices as they pertain to what forms you would use and what documents need to be included. But you can also leverage placeholders even if you are an individual agent not working in an account moderated by your broker. So we would click on Create Placeholder. Let's see, what do I usually need if I'm working with a seller? Let's do an attorney letter. Obviously, at the point that I start this transaction or that I am creating this template, I don't have that attorney letter yet. Even when I create the transaction initially, I may not have it. So what this placeholder does, and I'm just going to click OK in the lower right, is it allows me to set a reminder. So I know at some point I'll have to be adding that attorney letter in. If we click on Add Doc again, placeholders, again, we'll click on that. I could do property photos. So once my seller takes those photos of their property or I come over and do it, I can add that in just so I have those to reference, or if the buyer's agent wants something, I'll have those right here at my disposal. And I can choose to use those or not. Once I add this template to my transaction, really just depends what I'm comfortable with. So I'm going to go over now to the cover sheet. I'm going to click to open that. Again, this is one of those forms from your South Carolina library. Some areas that you may want to steer clear of when you're setting up your template is transaction-specific information. So ideally, we want to be able to repurpose this template for multiple transactions of the same type. Therefore, it would not make sense to enter in a seller name of the whatever transaction we happen to be working on now, because that's going to be variant. It's going to change with our next transaction. So we're going to scroll past the buyer and seller information, past the property information, and let's go to the listing broker information. So since this is us, we can pretty easily determine what information needs to go in here. It's not going to probably be changing too much. That's a bad example. Let's do. We're going to do a number in here. And we're going to do the listing agent's name. So that's going to be me in this case. And the agent's phone number. And again, I'm just typing in some arbitrary numbers here just to get this filled out, and the email address. So ideally, when I do a listing transaction from now on, I'm never going to have to key this information again unless something happens to change with my address or with my phone number or whatever the case may be. All right. So once I save that, and you can see I did that just by clicking save in the upper left-hand corner, let's open a different document. Let's do this exclusive right to sell. And you can see that there is one entry here, ABC Realtors. That's because I entered that in a different form, and all of your South Carolina forms, what they're going to do is the information is going to populate over to any other areas of forms that request that information. So a nice time-saving feature for you because you don't need to key in that same information for every single transaction that you're working on. And I just want to pause for one moment. Tammy, you have asked on the global and office option, we're circling back to when I created the template here. She asks, am I able to add someone to my office? I work with a partner who has their own zipForm account. So what you would actually need is in order to do that is a multi-user account. So those global and office options are not available if you're in an individual agent, regardless of if someone in your office also form account. If anyone has any questions about multi-user accounts, which is an upgrade, I'm happy to provide you with that information. We're going to click back. All right, so we've established our documents area of our template, and it's taken us about 10 minutes to set this up, but this is going to be saving us a ton of time relative to that in the future when we create transactions. Let's circle over to the Parties tab. You'll notice that one of my parties has been automatically generated by my documents. Now this information workflow goes two ways. So if I were to say, okay, I work with the same title company pretty much every time. There's a company or a title officer that I recommend to my clients. I can click on that. And this would obviously be for the buyer, but just to give you an example. And this would be true of any party that you add in. Anywhere on the form that requires this information for the title officer or the attorney or whatever the case may be, that's going to populate those areas in the documents too. So this is really the meat of the zipTMS functionality is auto-filling fields. Any entry you make into a template or a transaction, the system is automatically going to find all of those fields that are the same, and it's going to populate them with the same information. So parties are already generated there. We go back to documents. We have some time-saving entries filled in. We've added all the documents we need, so we're all good there. Let's move one tab more over to the right to checklists. Checklists, you can establish a list of action items for this particular side of the deal. And this is going to help streamline that process all the way from listing to closing. Let's create a new checklist. Let's click on New Checklist, and I'm going to do seller, one for seller responsibilities. And click Save, and this would be like the alternative to creating a to-do list every time you're working on a deal. And you can customize the category if you would like. For example, if I click on this pen icon, and I give this category the name of pre-closing. Let's click on the blue. I can change up the color if I want and click save. And you can see that changes that and kind of breaks up that monotony a little bit. If I create another checklist, maybe I would do attorney information. So anything pertaining, to the attorney or anything that I need, I can add that checklist in too. So there are a number of different checklists that you can add, and it just depends on what you do in the context of your deals that you work on. Once you create a checklist, you can create a new task. If I click on this, maybe I would do get carpets cleaned. I can set the due date as none, or I can also set the due date to relative. In this case, I would recommend foregoing the fixed option because you will have to change it if it changes in the transaction. So you can set the due date as none and then establish it once you add this template to the transaction, or you can click on relative and you can establish this as, say, 10 days before date of contract. And if you want to change the checklist name, you can. You can change this to, say, getting ready for showing. So you can see that everything's very customizable and you can adjust it based on what you want. We have this 10 days before the date of contract. I'm going to add one more item to this checklist, create a new task, and I'm going to do something like maybe wash windows. So it can be the simplest things or it can be something pretty standard. I'm just going to call that wash windows for now. I can assign a responsible party and then click save. And you may notice that I did not set a due date for this task. That's because later when we apply this template to a transaction, I'm going to show you the difference between if you add a due date and if you don't. All right, so we're going to just pretend that we've created a really robust checklist template, that we've added more of those categories and checklists, and obviously you can do that depending on what you want to see in your template. All right, so that's our preliminary work that we do for our listing and for our buyer's transactions. Let's circle over to our transactions tab, which is one tab to the left, as you can see. Let's flash forward to a scenario and say, okay, I am ready to create a new transaction. I have someone who contacted me. They really are interested in having me help them list their house. However, they got recommended to me. And I say, okay, let's go ahead and create a transaction for you, for your listing. So we can click new from right under transactions. And we're going to establish that this is in fact a new listing. If we were working with a buyer, we would of course establish new purchase or offer. We're going to click new listing here. And I'm going to give the transaction a name. I can name it after the actual property address, which I would usually recommend. But you can also name it after your seller if you're more comfortable with that. Below, we're going to establish our property type, residential obviously, and I don't know if you noticed, but if you look right at the bottom, you'll see that that listing template that we created has now been automatically applied. That's just based on those auto apply settings. So the two conditions are that it's a listing transaction and that it's a residential property for this template to be applied. So if I were to say, click on industrial, you can see that template disappears. So it's contingent upon those two conditions being set that it would auto apply. At the bare minimum, when you create a transaction, you just want to be sure to name it and establish the property type. If there is a template that is auto applied, you can find that here. If you chose not to automatically apply your template, you can also click on select template and you can locate it from here. You can see our listing template is right here. All you have to do is click to add it. So there are two different ways that you can add that template information in. We're going to go down to the bottom and click save. And presto, we have created a brand new deal, a file that will house all of that information. This is called the transaction summary that you'll see immediately after you create your transaction. We're going to circle back here in just a moment, but I do want to quickly take you across on a tour of the transaction specific tabs. The reason that I like to kind of reiterate the fact that these are transaction specific is because it starts to get a little bit confusing when you open up a transaction. You're seeing all of these tabs down here, but you're also seeing them up at the top. So the easiest way I would say to remember this is that the navigation bar up at the top is universal. This is going to help you access everything inside of your zipForm Plus account versus your transaction specific tabs. Everything here is only going to be pertinent in this case to 143 Apple Avenue, which is the house that we're listing. Before we go on a tour of these, I just want to quickly check our question box. Randall, you have asked, how do I delete old or previous clients' forms and accounts? That's a great question. So if you have a client that you already closed the deal with or something fell through, you're not working with them anymore, what you can do is actually archive the transaction. I would recommend leaving the transaction inside of zipForm Plus only because if you delete the transaction, it's gone forever. There's really no way to retrieve it. So all transactions are stored in accordance with your particular state's retention period. For example, and I can't think of South Carolina off the top of my head, but if anyone's interested, I think it's 3 years. You can feel free to let me know. I think in Michigan here where I'm at, we have 5 years that a transaction will be stored inside of zipForm Plus. After that 5 years, it leaves the system. We do have the option to export it, but I'll show you how you can go and delete your transactions, but I would really advise against that because if you need to go and access that information, it's going to be gone. We'll circle back on how to do that in just a moment. Inside of our transaction, as I mentioned, you do have the summary. This is going to show all of the most basic pertinent information for this listing. So we have our street address, our city, our county. We can fill this information in here, and I'll just do a couple fields. I'm just clicking in the fields in order to add those in. And I can click Save. You'll notice that our friend Jim here is already reflected on the left-hand side. That is because he carried over from the template we created. We're going to see more entries that carried over from that in just a moment. We're going to go over next to our parties. You can see that some of those were automatically established based on the content in our template. It did carry over. However, now we can get into more transaction-specific information. So the goal again of templates is going to be to create the most basic repurposable information in a file. You can add that every time to the transaction, and then you start to build on it by making it more specific. So you're saving some time. If I click on Seller 1, I can add in my seller. We'll say Bob James here. And for our friend Bob, I can actually save him as a contact. This, again, is my seller because if I want to use his information again, it will then be available for me. Scrolling down to the bottom, we click Save, and that's going to save up Bob here. Now, when we open any of our documents, you'll find that Bob is automatically added in. Let's circle over here to our Documents tab, and let's open that cover sheet. If we scroll up to the top, we will see Bob's name right there has been added in. He is now our Seller 1. As I mentioned, zipTMS has that added benefit of having information autofill into fields that are actually the same or similar. We'll say that Brenda is our Seller 2. She and Bob are a married couple. They want to list their house because they found something else that they like better. They're ready to move. So we added Brenda in here. We go up to the top, click Save, and click Back. And now if we go over to Parties, you'll also see Brenda reflected there. So again, just more evidence of that information workflow moving both ways. Back to our documents. If I open any of these forms, what I'm going to find is that not only has the information carried over from the template, And if we scroll down, we see that in the listing broker information, so we don't have to fill that out now. But it's also filled in from information we added in transaction summary or parties. I could have just come right to this form and filled all of that information out, and it would have populated those areas as well. So it doesn't really matter where you start. You can start in your forms, or you can fill out your transaction summary. Let's go through and just add a couple fields in here. Let's do our listing date. Let's do our listing price. And as you gather more data and more information on the transaction, you can add this information in kind of as you go. Move up to the top, click Save. So that's how you would start to kind of flesh out those forms. Let's talk a little bit about our placeholders now. Now that we have those placeholders added to this transaction, we can decide, okay, do I have any property photos I want to add? Do we have an attorney letter? I'm going to click property photos. We'll say we took a couple photos of this property. I want to add them in so that I have them in my transaction. I click Browse for Document. And it's actually, again, going to bring up the hard drive of my computer. And from here, let's just add the photo of this house. I can click Open, and then click OK. And that's going to add that right into that placeholder. So now that placeholder has vanished, and in its place is a photo that I took of the property. So that's how you would fill a placeholder. To the right of documents is our checklist. If we move over here, we can see that in fact that checklist we created for the template has now been applied to this transaction. So the more robust you can make your checklist, the more use you're going to be able to get out of it. You can see our getting ready for showing category, and if I had more time in today's session, I'd add a lot more to this checklist, but because we are on limited time, if you have any questions about how to create a more robust checklist or would like me to send you a sample checklist, I'm happy to do that so that you can kind of play around and get familiar with this feature. One of our checklist items is contingent upon having this date of contract set. So let's go back and do that. You can do that inside of your summary, or if any of your forms have fields to add that information in, you can do that as well. Because we created a new listing, you'll see that our listing summary appears on the top, while our purchase summary appears second on the bottom. If we had created a new purchase or offer as opposed to a listing today, that purchase summary would appear on top with that listing summary then demoted to the bottom. In order to add dates in for this, you can just click on the pen icon. That's going to render this field editable. So if I just click, you can see nothing's happening. I have to click on that pen icon. Once I do, it's going to allow me to adjust those. So we'll set a listing expiration date. We'll say April 30th for that. And once we know a little bit more about the buyer that we're potentially going to be accepting that offer from, we can add the information in there. So we'll say that our buyer made that offer, or is going to make that offer rather, on the 13th. That offer expiration date is going to be on the 16th. We'll say that he ended up accepting it. That acceptance was on the 17th. The date of contract was also on the 17th, and that final purchase price is going to be $350. And then we can also set a closing date. We'd like our closing date to be April 30th, so we'll set that, and then click Save up at the top. So this is just one way you can add information in. Another, right through your transaction summary. Another way is, of course, in your documents or forms. Let's move back to that checklist. Now that we set that date of contract, and some other dates, you'll notice that our transaction dates are tracked here. So any transaction specific date that we enter in, and those are like the really big dates that matter, like the offer date or date of contract, closing, listing date, those are all reflected here under our checklist now. So that helps us stay on top of exactly when those dates were. You'll notice that now, because I set this as 10 days before the date of contract, because the date of contract was April 17th, this has automatically converted to April 7th. So that's the benefit of adding a relative due date. It's relative to a key transaction date. Once you set that, you'll know exactly when that item is due. Right now, we're at the disadvantage of the fact that this due date was actually 10 days before. So we're overdue. It's showing us that we're overdue with that little exclamation point. So we say, okay, this has changed a little bit. I want to change this due date. You can do that by clicking on the due date itself. And we can change this now. 10 days before date of contract, we could either do, okay, we're going to do instead 6 days before the date of contract, or we can just choose a fixed due date of April 11th. We'll click Save, and now we know that this is in fact due today, so that's why it is giving us that little yellow exclamation. It's letting us know, warning, this needs to be completed by the end of the day. So just helping you to streamline your action items a little bit further from within your transaction in zipForm Plus. If we move to the right of checklist, you'll see the notes section. This is really nothing too fancy. It just allows you to attach a note to a transaction. This would be an awful lot like sticking a sticky note on one of your contracts, just to remind you. So maybe I'll click New, and maybe I'll say reach out to the buyer's agent regarding counter offer by 4/11. Again, just a quick example. On the right-hand side, you'll see this little save icon. If we click on that, that locks that note in. And now I can email it to myself if I want. I can even save it as a PDF and print it out and put it on my desk as a reminder, tack it on my bulletin board, whatever the case may be. If you want to delete a note, you can do that as well. But this note is going to be now attached to this transaction. To the right of notes is history. This is serving as an audit trail for all events that have transpired since the beginning of this transaction. So since we created this deal inside of zipForm Plus. As we start to work our way through the closing process, we'll see this history fill out a little bit more. The history is mostly just for your reference, or if your broker wants to check something, you'll have that history of exactly what you did inside of the system. And finally, to the right of history is services. I'm not going to be delving too deeply into this today, but just so you're familiar with this area, services takes all of our partner integrations, and these are service providers or companies that we've partnered with, and it just hypothetically applies them to your transaction. So you can decide based on where you're at in your closing process, or if you need any additional services. For example, you can order a title online if you want to, if you're not committed to any title company. You can find information for marketing and productivity. So a lot of things you can do here. Feel free to peruse this in your own time. Around 70% of our partner integrations are free users. So I would encourage you to take a look and see if there's anything that could benefit you. Circling back to checklists. All right, you say, but where do all of these items go? Like, where do they ultimately end up? Well, they end up in tasks on your navigation bar. While checklist is a very transaction-specific way of looking at action items, tasks up at the top is going to take all action items that you have for every single active transaction. So you can see that I have 143 Apple Avenue, and those different action items are reflected here. We also have a couple that transactions that we're working on. So working with a couple of different sellers right now, and that information and those tasks are also reflected. So tasks allows you a really quick space that you can go and get an overview of all of the deals that you're working on. You can also go up to where it says zipLogix calendar, clicking on that drop down. If you use Google Calendar or Microsoft Calendar and keep some action items scheduled on those, you can sync up with those. I'll use Google as an example. It allows me to sign in to my outside account. I'm just going to click allow, and it will sync up all of those outside tasks with your zipForm Plus account. And that will stay for the remainder of your active session. So that's just a very high-level overview of how tasks work. And again, with tasks, you can quickly mark something, mark the status of a task. For example, this post-closing for this transaction, we'll say that 1108 William Street has been closed. That deal is finalized. I can click on the little check mark all the way on the left, and that will mark that as completed. You can see it changed right here. Another way is to click on the drop down where it says not started, and you can change them to a multitude of different statuses. You can change it to completed, not applicable, needs review, or we'll do in progress for this. We'll say that they're having those carpet cleaning people out today. So once that's finished and my seller lets me know that that house is ready for showing, we're going to click and change that to completed. Let's go back to our transaction. We're going to do that by clicking on transactions and then clicking 143 Apple Avenue in order to open it up. Now circling back to, I forget who asked this question. Randall, you had asked, how do I delete old or previous client forms and accounts? In order to delete a transaction as a whole, you would just click on the little arrow icon. It's not going to be evident if you're not hovering over the transaction, so you have to hover over it, and then you'll see this little arrow drop down. Click on that, and it's going to give you a couple different options from which you can choose. Delete is the option that would get all of that transaction information out of the way. I would highly recommend instead clicking export to archive, because then you'll still have that information. If you ever need to retrieve it, you can call up to us. We can make sure that you can access it in your account, but that is what I would recommend. It will get it out of the way, but you won't be actually deleting it to the point where you can never retrieve it again if you need to. I hope that kind of answers that question. A couple people have asked for that sample checklist. I will be sure to send that your way. Let's just see if there are any other questions. So anyone who asked for that session 1 of this series or for that sample checklist, I will send those to you via email, and I have all your emails already. Let's click to open up this transaction one last time. And I'm just going to show you a couple different features of inside of your transactions before we wrap up today. From your transaction summary, as I mentioned, all information that you input here is going to be reflected in any other field that requires it. So if I were to go right now and say, okay, I want to add my buyer's agent, I click on selling agent and broker. I put in their name. And I can also put in her brokerage. For the sake of time, I'm just going to show you those fields. I can also save her as a contact. And then at the bottom, click Save. So now that we've added our selling or buyer's agent Sheila in here, let's go over to our documents. And if I open up that cover sheet again, I'm now going to see Sheila's name reflected here, and it's going to be right down here under selling broker information, being that my listing broker information has already populated over from my template. Right. Moving back over to the summary, you can also add additional documents. So if you need something that wasn't included in the template you applied, you can feel free to add an outside document to your transaction at any time. That's just the shortcut to get over to documents, clicking on that add document icon. You can also just go right to documents and click add doc, or you can click on add document from the summary page. So just 2 different avenues to take in order to get there. If you forgot to add your template when you created your transaction, don't worry about it. You can add it from right inside of your transaction too by clicking Apply Template. So the beauty of zipForm Plus is it allows a lot of different ways for you to perform the same action. If you missed it earlier on, you don't have to worry. There will be another opportunity for you to do what you need to. So again, just to reiterate one last time, all of the information that we have added in here will be flowing over to our forms. But where else does it go? Well, it also goes to your agent dashboard, which is located just to the left of your transactions. And if you're just getting familiar with zipForm Plus, this may not be the time to start using the dashboard yet, but once you get a little bit more familiar with how your transactions function, you'll be able to utilize this dashboard a little bit more. Just a really high-level overview of what your agent dashboard is. It is a hub that consolidates all of your most important information. Now, as you can probably see, if I click anywhere on this dashboard, I can't edit anything. So what's the purpose of it? The purpose is to bring information over from your transactions and consolidate them all in one space, much like tasks that we saw a little bit earlier with our checklists. The three things that need to happen for your dashboard to populate, and if you have a piece of paper, you might want to write this down. 3 pieces of information are necessary. One is going to be key monetary figures. That would be like a listing price or a purchase price. That's what's going to populate this quarterly sales information. Another item is key transaction due dates. So for example, if we scroll down, we see one listing that expires this month. And if we click on this widget, we'll see that it is in fact 143 Apple Avenue. It also provides us with a hyperlink so that if we click on 143 Apple Avenue, we end up right back inside of that transaction where we were before. So the dashboard allows you a lot of quick shortcuts too to get to certain places. So key monetary figures are one thing. Key transaction due dates are another thing, and that would be like April 30th. So because this listing has an expiration this month, it shows that on the dashboard under listings that expire this month. And you don't have to do anything on the dashboard. Once you establish that information inside of your transaction, it's automatically going to tell the dashboard, okay, this information is filled out, make sure that you add it in. Close transactions. So the third thing that you need to do in order to get your dashboard to populate is to actually set your transaction status. We'll go ahead and do that right now. Let's go back to our transaction that we were working on. We'll say that our seller has accepted our buyer's offer and we've gone through all the paperwork. We're ready to go ahead and close this transaction. So we'll scroll down. We added in that final purchase price. We can even go down to our commission summary, sell side information. We can enter in a commission percentage. That's going to calculate that listing commission relative to that final price. We can also do buyer's commission if you are the buyer's agent. When we click save and scroll back up to the top, now we can determine the transaction status. Up until now, it's been active, or perhaps we have a transaction that's pending. We're waiting to find out if we're the buyer's agent, if that offer was accepted. You can set it to pending. You can set someone to a prospect if you haven't had them sign that agency agreement yet, but you think that it might be a potential lead. You can mark your transactions as prospect. If something happens, the offer is not accepted, someone decides to not go with that property, you can always click fell through. But in this case, we're going to click close. We'll say that everything is good and this transaction is ready to be finalized. We click on closed. It's going to give us a little bit of information about the retention date, which is what I was talking about earlier. We click OK, and that locks in that transaction. Now let's go back to our dashboard. See how those numbers changed? So now because of that final purchase price, our quarterly sales is now reflected at 350. Our commission has increased based on the commission percentage we added in, and our closed transactions have now changed from 3 to 4. If we click on this run full report icon, which looks like a little stock market arrow, that's going to bring us into our expanded view of those transactions that have been closed. And there's our friend 143 Apple Avenue right here. And we can click on that at any time in order to jump back into that transaction. Just a couple more things about the dashboard before we wrap it up today. You may have noticed that listings that expire this month, that has changed now to 0 from 1. And that's because that listing, of course, went up now to our closed transactions. Transactions that close this month is going to be based on the closing date, whereas listings that expire this month is going to be contingent upon the listing expiration date. If it happens sometime in the month of April, it's going to populate this area. Retentions ending in 30 days is what I was talking about a little bit earlier. If you have a transaction that's coming up on its retention date, that means it's going to be leaving the system, it's going to notify you of that here. That way you can click, you can export that information. Right now I don't have any, but if I did, I would just click on a little checkbox that allows me to check it and click export. It's going to export that transaction information into a zip file, and you can save that on your computer. Recent activity is a lot like history in a transaction, except instead of tracking that transaction information, this is actually tracking all of the activity across your zipForm Plus account. Again, a lot of these hyperlinks are clickable, so you can go ahead and click. It's going to jump you right to that activity or item. And then finally, you have your potential sales volume. This is tracking some of those numbers. You also have your tasks not started, your overdue tasks, active property types, active transaction types. So you can see a number of different components are tracked on your dashboard. I know this is a really kind of fast overview of the dashboard, but if you want to take a tour of it on your own, you can just click on Guided Help in the lower right-hand corner and click on Widgets in the dashboard. And that's going to allow you to take a more in-depth tour of what everything in the dashboard does. Guided help is also available for transactions or templates. So if after today's session you want to go and try setting up a template, let's use this as a better example. You can click on Guided Help, creating a new template, and it will walk you through the steps of creating that new template just like we did today. All right, cool. A couple of people have asked, and yes, absolutely, this training is being recorded. If you would like to re-watch it, you are welcome to do so. The session will come to you within around 24 hours. So if you don't see it right away after we wrap it up today, don't worry, it is coming. It's going to come to the email that you use to register for the session. Carrie, you have asked, would you be able to send information on zipCRM? Absolutely, I sure can. So zipCRM is our customer relationship management system. It is an add-on to zipForm Plus. If anyone's interested in that, I do have some information. Carrie, I will email that over to you after the webinar today. Latori, and I apologize if I'm pronouncing your name wrong, you have asked, is this only accessible by agents? If not, how do we share access with our clients so that they can also see the tasks? So there are a couple different ways that you can do that. One option is, let me just pop back into the transaction I was working on. One option is when you're establishing checklist items, click checklists. We'll go down to this one that I added the responsible party as the seller. If I want to notify that seller, I can click and I can do notify responsible party when due. I turn that to yes. And so the responsible party is then going to receive this notification in their email inbox. Now you may have noticed that little pop-up that read responsible party email address is missing. Make sure that you add an email address into your forms for that individual. So if I'm working with Sally Seller, I'll want to add Sally's email into my forms, and this will track that email and it will send a notification to Sally letting her know that washing windows is coming due so that she needs to complete that. So that's how you would share those outside tasks. Lowell, you have asked, can a checklist be imported to a template? Yes, it can, and I'll show you how. So when you have created a template, I'll actually show you, I'll create a new one. I create a new listing template, let's say. If you already have a checklist template, you can just click on Select Template, and you can select it from here. For example, Transaction Checklist Template. If I have already kind of set that up, I can apply it to the template that I'm creating. Now that's one way. If you're asking if a checklist that you have like in a Microsoft Word document can be imported into a template, then unfortunately right now the answer is no. There's no way to add that in as template tasks. You can import it as an actual Word document or PDF into your transaction, but it won't actually itemize those items as checklist items. I hope that kind of makes sense. Let's see what else. Elizabeth, yes, I will send you the zipCRM information as well as Carrie. Jeffrey, you have asked anything on eSign today. No, but that is actually going to be the subject of next month's session. So next month we are going to be going over eSign, but if you have a question about eSign or need some help before then, you can feel free to email me. I'm actually going to pull our contact information up so that You can see it. Okay. All right, so here's all our contact information. If you need help troubleshooting your account, you can call our customer care line at 586-840-0140. They're available Monday through Friday, 24 hours to assist you, and also weekends and holidays, they are now 24 hours as well. That would be for any kind of technical issue. If you just have a question about how to use eSign or how to use a different part of the system inside of zipForm Plus, you're more than welcome to email. I answer these emails for the most part, but it is our team email at training@ziplogix.com. So feel free to email us there at any time if you have questions, if you need help with eSign before the next session, or anything kind of that nature. And I see a lot of requests for sample checklists. I will be happy to send those to you. Jeffrey, you have asked, can you e-sign on a template? No, you would apply the template to the transaction, and then you can send the transaction for e-sign. And any questions about e-sign, again, more than happy to answer those. Just email us at training@ziplogix.com and say, hey, I'd like some information on e-sign, and I can kind of help walk you through that process. If you're on social media, feel free to connect with us. We are on Facebook, LinkedIn, Twitter. You can also tag us on Instagram. So if you are on there, feel free to find us. We would love to connect with you. And I'll just skip this one. I do thank everyone very much for taking the time to attend today. I know you're all busy, so we do appreciate your time. And if you have any questions before the next session, feel free to, again, give us an email at training@ziplogix.com. My name is Laura, and it's been my pleasure to be your host today. I hope that everyone has a wonderful rest of your week, and see you next month.